Castro lashed out at critics. At year's end, Cuba remained a scene of unrest.
Cuba, 1961, a time of chaos and fear. As it became clear that Fidel Castro's revolution was in fact a communist dictatorship in the making, many Cubans began to panic. Sylvia Curiel, a mother of 4 children, was one of them.
They would be spying on you, anything you did. They would know what you were doing.
Castro's government began seizing property and businesses, jailing and killing the opposition.
You could see every day there was somebody being shot, and not one, quite a few the same day.
Castro's regime aims to indoctrinate the young in the ways of communism.
Sylvia's children could no longer attend Catholic school. The government shut them down. Public school with a communist curriculum was the only alternative.
Public school, with all that crap that was there, and having to wear a uniform and having to sing to the Russian Revolution, no, I wasn't going to do that.
What's more, the uncertainty of life seemed to fuel frightening rumors about the children.
What rumors were going around at the time?
They want to take the kids away from you. So I said, no, I don't want that. I want my children to be free.
Word spread among parents of a way to get their kids out of Cuba quickly. The State Department would allow children under 18 to enter the U.S. without a visa. But there was one catch: only the children.
The only thing I thought of was taking them out of there, getting them out of there as soon as possible.
This was the fast track out of Cuba, and thousands of parents faced a wrenching choice. Stay as a family in Cuba and risk your future, or send your kids ahead and face the possibility of never seeing them again. For Sylvia Curiel, there was no choice.
I did it against my husband's will and my father's will.
What went into making that decision as a mother?
I love my children more than anything in the world. I'd rather not see them again if I had to.
And you thought about that possibility. Was it a hard decision?
Very hard. Very hard.
Sylvia took her 3 older children to the airport and put them on a path to the unknown, a flight to Miami, alone. John Curiel, then 10 years old, remembers.
What did you think when you looked at your parents?
How much I loved them.
To stay behind? To send you?
Both. They were doing what was best for me.
The Curiel children were among thousands of Cuban youngsters, about 2/3 of them boys, who began streaming into Miami for what they believed was temporary shelter, until they could go back home or their parents could come to Miami. Once in the U.S., they were put under the care of Monsignor Brian Walsh, then a young priest in charge of Catholic charities in Miami.
Motivation was to save children from communism.
Overwhelmed by sheer numbers, Catholic charities created camps in Miami to house the children who had no relatives to claim them. Others were sent to boarding homes and foster families around the country.
Once news of the rescue mission leaked, the U.S. media dubbed it Operation Pedro Pan, Spanish for Peter Pan, because it was children who were flying to a new land. But unlike the fictional character who would never grow up, the 14,000 Cuban children who landed here in Miami without their parents were forced to grow up quickly, and in some cases, painfully.
It was a difficult time. Very difficult time for a young boy, no parents.
John Curiel began to live in a camp in Miami.
It was difficult.
And suddenly everything's missing.
It wasn't missing. It was taken away. My parents didn't make a decision against the family. That decision was pretty much made for them.
For a while, the plan seemed to work. About half the families were reunited in America within a few months. But then came the hottest moment of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. The United States and the Soviet Union almost went to war over nuclear missiles the Soviets set up in Cuba. It brought flights between the U.S. and Cuba to an abrupt halt, leaving some 8,000 children stranded in the U.S. without their parents. For Sylvia Curiel, the separation she thought would last months stretched to years.
Do you ever feel desperate? Do you remember feeling desperate?
sometimes, whenever I got a letter or a phone call from them.
What were you hearing in your children's voices about how they were adjusting?
They were sad, that sometimes they would cry. That broke my heart.
And what would they say?
Mommy, when are you coming?
And you had no answer for them?
No. I always said, soon. Wait, I'll be there. There's nothing I could do.
Meanwhile, the ache of separation. Holidays, birthdays celebrated miles apart. The passage of time with no resolution in sight.
It was terrible talking to them, hearing their voices. I knew they were changing. They were older.
This is San Rafael, where I spent about 8 months.
John Curiel began to make friends among the other children in the camp. He learned English and went to school, but he desperately missed his family.
What would you have done if you'd been the parent?
I would have done the same thing, without hesitation.
But other children who endured the separation of Operation Pedro Pan aren't so sure. Alfredo Lanier remembers mostly unhappiness.
Emotionally, the atmosphere was very grim.
Lanier, now a writer for the Chicago Tribune, wrote an editorial calling the operation cruel. After spending time in a camp, he was eventually sent to live with an Irish-American foster family on Long Island, New York, away from any Cuban culture.
I felt isolated, totally isolated, because you didn't even have a family you could rely on that you can come home to at night. It was a totally cultural, you were like in Mars.
And he is not alone.
There's too much evidence that at least the propaganda arm of the CIA was using this to their advantage to believe that it was exclusively humanitarian.
Maria de Los Angeles Torres is a political science professor at DePaul University in Chicago, who arrived in the U.S. at age 6 through Operation Pedro Pan. After years of research, she has come to suspect that rumors in Cuba of children being taken away by Castro, rumors that scared people like Sylvia Curiel into sending away her kids, were in fact planted by the CIA.
I had to save them.
You had to save them?
Yes.
I have interviewed Cubans who worked with the CIA in the underground who were told it's not true, but we need to use this in order to spread panic.
The U.S. government, she says, could use the panic and the exodus to show how bad things were in Cuba and turn public opinion against the revolution. And Torres' worst suspicion is that the United States used the Cuban parents' torment of being separated to create more anti-Castro sentiment and to destabilize his government.
Do you think the U.S. government would use 8,000 kids as sacrificial lambs like that? That
They
seems
did.
hard to conceive.
Right, it does seem very hard to conceive, but I think when we look back in the history of the CIA, particularly during that period, they did a lot of crazy things.
But if it served the purpose of getting so many Cubans out of Cuba, so many of whom are grateful they're here, then what's the problem?
The problem is the way that it happened, because it could have been done without separating families.
Torres says the U.S. government should have made it quick and easy for entire families to leave, not just the children. For 6 years, she has been trying to get access to CIA records, and in January filed a lawsuit against the agency. At the time, the CIA told Torres and Dateline it had no relevant documents on the operation. The agency now says it has since conducted an exhaustive search and has found several documents mentioning the operation, but no indication that the CIA took any part in it. Torres remains unconvinced and is continuing her research.
If indeed you find out that the CIA was part of a big propaganda ploy, what would you think of that?
Oh, that part of what happened, I think it's morally reprehensible.
But Torres' opinion is not very popular in the Cuban-American community. Many former Pedro Pan children like John Curiel say it was their salvation.
If the CIA was involved, gosh, I wish they'd do say it, so I could personally thank them.
John Curiel had to wait almost 5 years to see his mother again.
Castro, in a surprise move, said that anyone...
In 1966, as thousands of Cuban parents secured places on the so-called freedom flights that Castro allowed to leave the island, Sylvia Curiel was finally reunited with her children.
I saw my 3 kids. I saw them. I remember that.
How'd they look?
Beautiful.
Sylvia Coriel now lives in Miami with all her children nearby. But the whole family was never reunited. Her husband is still in Cuba.
Coming up.